In April 1945, the Pacific War obeyed a single hard law. Whoever owned the sky decided what lived on the sea. Yet in Kure and Tokuyama, Japan prepared a gesture vast enough to argue with that law. At its center stood Yamato, 80,000 tons of steel in ceremony, the largest battleship ever built, a floating cathedral to a doctrine already dying. Okinawa burned on the horizon beneath rings of American carriers. Japan's air arm was threadbare, fuel scarcer than courage, and orders harsher than hope. Still, a directive hardened. Sail south with light cruiser Yahagi and a handful of destroyers, sprint the Bungo Strait, turn toward Okinawa, beach the flagship, and fire her great guns as immobile artillery until nothing remained. The name was Operation Tengo. On paper it looked like resolve. In truth, it read like confession, that pride could be spent like blood, that a symbol might buy minutes no squadron would. American submarines were listening. American radio rooms were listening. Weather and wave were indifferent judges, and the ocean remembered everything. Below decks, men packed letters they would never post, folded them twice, and tucked them into pockets as if cloth could keep them safe. Boiler rooms breathed, pump handles clacked. A chaplain rehearsed words for which there is never enough breath. Above, signal lamps winked clues into darkness, boots rang on ladders. A boatswain's pipe sliced the evening like a silver nail. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito understood the arithmetic and saluted it anyway. To refuse meant honor would curdle. To accept meant lives would be poured into a vessel already half a monument. He walked his bridge like a man measuring a room he might not leave. Gunnery captains counted armor-piercing shells like relics. Radar sets were tuned and retuned until their dials felt warm. Damage control parties rehearsed drills from Midway and the Philippine Sea with fewer pumps, fewer hands, fewer illusions than the manuals assumed. Somewhere on shore, families listened for sirens and heard only wind. Night gathered across the inland sea. Lines were cast off, screws bit and turned water into a rolling rumor that spread shore to shore. Destroyers formed a tight constellation about the giant. Yahagi kept station, lean and pugnacious, her funnels smudging the starboard sky. The inland waters offered the illusion of shelter, lanterns winking from villages that had long since learned to speak softly after dark. Then the exit opened, Bungo Strait yawning like a mouth. Beyond lay gray swell, a wind that smelled of iron, and a sky that was never empty anymore. What does courage mean when strategy is already broken? Before sunrise, Yamato would answer in wake and fire. Somewhere astern, gulls lifted from pilings and wheeled once. Ahead, only distance and duty remained to be measured by tired men who knew the measure would likely be final. In a shuttered operations room, the maps glowed like islands, their coastlines pinned by lamps with green hoods. Men argued in careful voices, the grammar of duty smoothing edges that fear would sharpen later. Admiral Toyota approved the sortie. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who would wear the outcome on his face, hesitated like a man testing a blade with his thumb. Refuse, and honor curdles in rumor. Accept, and thousands of lives are poured into a vessel, already half a monument. Staff officers stacked reasons with tidy hands. Relieve Okinawa's garrison, draw American air, prove resolve to a nation living on ration tickets and ash. Beneath rhetoric sat arithmetic, no meaningful air cover, fuel scarcely enough for a one-way dash, a light cruiser and destroyers to screen a leviathan that could not outrun the century. Orders rippled outward through phones, runners, lamps. Ammunition parties counted armor-piercing and high-explosive shells like relics. Radar sets were tuned and retuned until their dials felt warm. Damage control leaders walked the ship with chalk and lists, rehearsing drills from Midway and the Philippine Sea with fewer pumps, fewer hands, fewer illusions than any manual contained. In compartments that smelled of oil and wet paint, sailors compared lucky charms and spoke of hometowns as if naming them could keep them reachable. Some wrote to mothers on thin paper and folded silence into the envelope along with words they could not find. Others cleaned already clean tools because ritual steadies the spine. On the quay, welders stitched over scars left by earlier raids. Sparks drifted and died on black water. A boatswain marked off sections of deck with a whistle sharp as a nail. Chaplains rehearsed sentences that never fit the mouth when metal begins to shout. The escort captains traced courses with blunt pencils, noting shoals, minefields, and the wind lanes that might blunt a torpedo's will. Yahagi's officers inventoried a ship built to knife forward and now tasked to stand beside a myth. When Ito finally signed the movement order, the room did not relax. It settled. Acceptance moves quieter than cheer. The pagoda mast outside etched a sky already owned by someone else. He stepped onto his bridge and felt the deck answer like an old horse brought out for a last hard run. Somewhere, code breakers in warm rooms translated fragments into a picture. Somewhere, carrier decks far away grew into wind. Between those rooms and this bridge lay hours. The men would fill them with competence, and then with courage. Yamato's decks were a geography of belief and steel. Triple 16-inch turrets crouched like monuments. Secondary batteries kept watch along the flanks. Directors peered from armored brows. Rangefinders stretched their slit pupils toward horizons that would soon be full of small, quick enemies. Along the parapets, clusters of 25mm mounts bristled, crews rehearsing traverse and elevation until muscles learned the song. The ship smelled of hot paint and cordite ghosts and the iron breath of boilers. Below, engineers nursed steam, listening with fingertips for a bearing that complained, a shaft that sang too sharply. They were plumbers of war. They knew how fast a corridor fills, how smoke steals thinking, how a valve sticks exactly when the book says it must not. Medics counted plasma bottles and morphine syrettes. Stretcher teams practiced turns in corridors already narrow before the sea tilted them. Chaplains counted heartbeats and names. In mess decks, rice bowls clinked with a restraint that sounded like prayer. A petty officer taught a recruit to shoulder a hose with his hip, not his hands. A turret captain walked his crews through rituals of angles and fuses, making ceremony out of repetition because ceremony holds men together when noise arrives. The route was chalked on the operations table. Inland sea to Bungo Strait, then southeast toward Okinawa through picket lines that existed on American notepads before Japanese eyes could see them. Somewhere, radio traffic would harden into certainty. Somewhere, submarines would taste pressure wakes and signal silently that a story had begun. For a few hours more it remained a ship's world. Mess tins, a boatswain's pipe, boots on ladders, the small courage of shaved faces and folded blankets. Above, lookouts scanned a sky that had become a ledger, each new dot an entry payable on demand. Gunnery officers argued calmly about deflection settings that would never matter against enemies who would not oblige with altitude. Fire control crews practiced local control in case the central brain went blind. Electricians checked emergency lighting, then pocketed talismans against darkness. In the plotting room, a young navigator traced the turn points with a trembling pencil that steadied by the third pass. When he looked up, he could see nothing beyond bulkheads, and yet felt watched by weather, by chance, by an era. "We are ready," someone said, and no one nodded, because readiness here meant only that the ship could begin to be tested. Courage. Dusk folded over the inland sea like a lid, and the squadron edged into motion with the caution of men stepping into a dark room they already knew by memory. Hawsers slipped, screws bit. A vibration gathered in Yamato's bones and moved outward through water until buoys shivered in their sleep. Yahagi kept station starboard, lean as a blade. Destroyers stitched a moving net. White wakes crossing and uncrossing like signatures no clerk would ever file. Signal lamps traded brief syllables. The replies felt older than electricity. In wheelhouses, helmsmen trimmed by degrees. On bridges, officers traced bearings with pencils brightened by hooded lamps and wiped eraser grit from charts with the backs of their hands. The inland waters offered the illusion of shelter. Village lanterns along black hillsides, the smell of wet earth, a shoreline that answered sound with sound. Then the exit opened, Bungo Strait, yawning like a mouth that did not care what it swallowed. Beyond it lay gray swell, a wind that tasted of rust, and a sky that was never empty anymore, even when nothing showed. Somewhere ahead, metal birds would be sleeping with their wings folded, and men in colored vests would be rehearsing movement in their heads. Somewhere astern, a code clerk would lift a page by its corner and feel the weight of a sentence no one could yet read aloud. On Yamato's bridge, Vice Admiral Ito stood with one hand on the rail, another on time itself, which never thickened when you wanted it to. He said little. The ship answered in vibration. Below, stokers fed the furnaces like men tending a shrine to movement. Oilers listened with wrenches for a rumor of trouble and preferred the honest language of gauges to any prayer. Past the strait, the sea felt larger, and even veterans found themselves breathing in rhythm with the roll, as if lungs could steady a world that tilted by its own laws. The radar room hummed. Operators leaned close to scopes that showed weather ghosts, gull-sized lies, and, now and then, a contact that made fingers tighten before reason returned. Lookouts scanned until their eyes watered, blinking tears that salt would claim. A boatswain secured loose gear that would become shrapnel if the ship lurched hard. A cook stacked bread for sandwiches no one would taste. A medic rewound gauze that had been rolled too tight by a nervous hand. The radio stayed terse. Reports acknowledged, nothing invited. The destroyer's sonars beat a metronome against the idea of invisibility. Yahagi flashed a question and received a patience for answer. Speed rose by degrees. The flagship's wake wrote a bright, brief sentence across the night and erased itself as quickly. Clouds slid low, protective 1 minute, suspicious the next. Moonlight arrived in torn pieces and left before opinion formed. The sea, impartial and immense, kept its own counsel. Men held theirs as well. Between this water and the water off Okinawa lay hours that competence could fill and courage might yet redeem. Somewhere ahead, morning sharpened a knife. Dawn peeled the horizon into bands of steel and pearl, and the useful lie of emptiness failed. South of Kyushu, American pickets combed weather gaps. On carrier flag plots, the smear of contacts thickened into certainty. Multiple ships, southbound, fast. Deck crews moved like a single tool. Yellow, green, red vests flowed around folded wings. Hatches gulped bombs and torpedoes as if feeding a furnace. Fighter directors sketched arcs on plexiglass. Strike leaders assigned altitudes, ingress points, egress turns, and the cruel advantage of repetition. Hellcats and corsairs would rake the sky. Helldivers would kneel on the decks. Avengers would bring the argument no gun could ignore. Aboard Yamato, general quarters snapped men into grooves they had worn with practice. Sirens clawed the air, boots hammered ladders, steel doors slammed with punctuation that meant readiness, and sometimes goodbye. Lookouts called specks that were birds until they were not. Many bearing 280, height low to medium. The pagoda mast bristled with eyes. Directors began to tick. Antennae flexed in the morning wind. On the chart, a pencil pushed a little harder where the route narrowed to choice. Turn left and accept one set of angles. Turn right and accept another. Orders kept voices flat. Screen tighten. Starboard destroyers extend. Yahagi maintain station. All mounts free far away but suddenly near. Flight decks became wind. First the combat air patrol lifted and stacked. Then the strike wave rolled. Avenger after Avenger nosing toward open water. Wings heavy with bright cylinders that would run straight if dropped clean and true. Pilots read checklists until the words made a metronome. Fuel, mixture, mags, trim, flaps, arming safe. Over the radio, a calm voice salted the fear. Remember, she turns habitually to port. Shape the herd. The battle assembled itself out of lines that converged because men intended them to. Fighters bounced the handful of defenders rising from shore. Most never reached the useful height where choices multiply. Dive bombers tested the flak's timing and found its rhythm. Tracers made orange fences that moved just late enough to be survived. The sea down low looked like polished slate, unhelpful and perfect. Approaching Avengers trimmed for the shove of wind beneath cliffs of steel. Torpedomen checked depth and speed with fingers that shook, then steadied. A lead pilot rocked his wings once and felt the formation breathe. Far below, Yamato's guns began to speak in syllables of blast and thunder, and the morning answered with the thin, relentless whine of aircraft committed to the last half-mile. The opening blows wrote themselves as punctuation, commas of near misses, semicolons of spray, then hard periods of impact. Helldivers stooped through the tracer lattice, bombs walking toward turrets, detonations shouldering water into white walls that slapped back across the deck and rattled teeth. Some attackers hauled out with cables screaming. A few did not. Time-fused bursts reached upward like fists that forgot the sky moves. Smoke folded itself into corners and then explored the ship like a thief. Low on the sea, the Avengers committed to geometry. They lined their approaches as carpenters sight a cut, correcting for crosswind and wake, watching the giants habit, a leftward safety that was no safety at all. "Port again," an American voice said, patient as a tutor. Torpedoes smacked water with workmanlike splashes, dove to set depth, and began to hum the straight, stubborn song that ends either in steel or in emptiness. Yamato answered with helm in order. Hard over, counter-flood, hold stations, do not chase shadows. The first hit rang the hull like a bell sounded under a cathedral, low and personal. Plates flexed, paint powdered, men bit their tongues, lights blinked. Below, someone tasted iron and knew what it meant. List began as a suggestion and became a fact. On slanting decks, crews fought gravity as much as enemy. Mounts meant for level platforms demanded calves of iron. Tracers sagged a hand's breadth low because the horizon had lied. Fire control brains took a hurt that turned calculation into hunch. Local control took over with will and smaller accuracy. Damage control teams, wet with sweat, then with the ship itself, moved as if dancing a drill learned in calmer chapters. Shut, brace, shore, pump. Wedges hammered, valves protested. Bulkheads took pencil marks that climbed diagonally like farewell notes. Around the flagship, the screen earned its name with pain. A destroyer slid across an attack lane to spoil a run and took a bomb that erased its argument. Another threw up a moving squall of fire and lived a minute longer than prediction. Yahagi, quick and brave, swallowed punishment meant for the myth beside her. Bombs that stunned, then a torpedo that bent her speed toward zero. Over radios, clipped acknowledgement replaced exclamation. Hit, turning, hit, turning. Every correction cost momentum. Every lost knot invited the next correction. The first wave lifted. The sea closed briefly over its wounds as if considering. Then the second wave arrived to ask the same hard questions with more insistence and better aim. By late morning, the rhythm hardened into a machine. Locate, fix, strike, reform, and strike again, each cycle shorter than the last, because practice breeds cruelty. Yahagi, pinned and punished, sagged into her own wake. Bombs walked her deckhouses with a bully's patience. A torpedo folded frames where speed had once lived. Black smoke curtained courage until courage became a silhouette against flame. She rolled, fought, and failed, men leaping through oil, life preservers blooming like small, stubborn flowers in filthy water. Destroyers discovered the old truth. Small ships learn beneath a hostile sky. Bravery has reach, but not altitude. One lost steering and carved circles that tightened toward doom. Another took a magazine hit that turned logic into light. The screen thinned until the flagship's size felt like solitude. American pilots adapted in real time. Torpedo squadrons staggered releases to meet turns halfway. Dive bombers hunted directors and rangefinders, blinding the eyes that make steel behave. Fighters strafed open mounts where men fed belts with hands that would not stop, because stopping felt like betrayal. Over Yamato's bridge, the air trembled with the ship's own voice, orders held flat by will, not by calm. Reports stacked without comfort, flooding forward, counterflood engaged, list increasing, speed down, steering answering sluggishly, some pumps cavitating, some lines fouled with debris that had been structure minutes earlier. In the engine spaces, heat turned from burden to enemy. Oil mist found flame and became a teacher without mercy. Electricians swore reverently at fuses that refused to save anyone. Damage control leaders learned new maps of old compartments as doors seized and ladders became traps. They counted teams at every threshold and counted fewer after, then went again, because counting is a ritual that makes choice bearable. Medics ran out of plasma before they ran out of need. A chaplain kept pace, launching words like small boats that sometimes floated and sometimes sank and were worth launching regardless. The next wave arrived with an exactness that felt like contempt for chance. Avengers slipped along lanes chewed temporarily clear by flak. Their shadows crawled the armor like premonitions. Left again, someone muttered, and the ocean accepted the habit as law. Torpedoes bit low where buoyancy is born and lives or dies. The ship groaned in a voice that remembered ore, furnace, blueprint, promise. Men braced as rooms changed shape around them, as the angle wrote new definitions of floor and wall. On carrier decks far away, ordnance men chalked kill marks they would later forget, and a few pilots climbed and found themselves quiet without understanding why. Lightheaded not with altitude but with the thought of attacking a mountain until it became a reef. List is not merely angle. It is consequence. Each portside strike dragged Yamato's world a few degrees further from normal, and with every degree the ship demanded new taxes from muscle, mind, and machine. Tables became slopes, ladders became negotiations, hatches argued with gravity. Counterflood orders went out in a cadence that sounded like hope and worked like triage, sacrificing volumes on starboard to chase a center line that slipped away like a word on the tongue. Compartments opened and closed in a choreography designed for wounds that could be survived, not for a patient repeatedly stabbed by mathematics. Speed bled. The bow began to bury even in modest swell. The rudder answered like a limb numbed by cold, then like a limb forgetting its job. Anti-aircraft crews fought physics as much as planes. Mounts meant for level platforms now pitched men into arcs that stole seconds and sometimes shots. Tracers that once stitched a clean fence sagged a hand's breadth low because the horizon itself had lied. The central fire control brain coughed, saw double, then saw nothing. Local control took over, with all the will and half the accuracy. Ammunition parties crab-walked shell cases up slopes that had not existed at dawn. A loader slipped, caught, rose, and kept feeding because the body will obey a task until it breaks. Below, damage control teams ran out of the right tools and made do with wrong ones. Wedges hammered, shores bit, knees substituted for hands when joints protested. Men breathed through rags soaked in water that was not clean but was cold, and cold mattered. A petty officer counted his team before opening a door and counted fewer after. He nodded once, wrote the number with chalk that squeaked, and went on. Pumps rattled, paused, and died. Hand pumps took their place, stubborn as prayer. Oil traced silver-black calligraphy across the sea, too delicate for a ship this brutal. On the bridge, Ito read the angle from instinct before the inclinometer told him anything. He understood that the voyage's point, symbol, shock, and artillery crown for a dying island, had been overtaken by the physics of metal and water policed by aircraft. He gave orders to preserve men where men could still be preserved and kept none back for himself. Around him, the bridge creaked like an old house in a new wind. Somewhere forward, a turret captain made the quiet decision between jamming and jettisoning. Somewhere aft, a cook handed out water cups and apologies. Above all of it, the sky remained busy and indifferent, measuring value in gallons burned and angles achieved and minutes denied. The way a ship suffers becomes a ledger. Credits, discipline, training, compartments that hold longer than expected, men who refuse to let go of tasks that no longer have meaning except that they are theirs. Debits, hits at the waterline, pumps that gulp air instead of purpose. Electricity turning treacherous as it seeks any path to ground through flesh and steel. By early afternoon, the ledger read red. Messages crackled from escorts and then thinned. Fires marked positions long after voices fell silent. Names: Isokaze, Hamikaze, Asashimo, moved from nouns into past tense. Fine ships reduced to coordinates and oil. American strike leaders, professional and unsentimental, paced the tempo to keep pressure constant. Dive bombers clipped away directors and cranes. Torpedo planes kept worrying the same flank until a habit became a wound, then a door. Fighters strafed decks to make every movement cost breath. Over radio nets, calm voices stacked small decisions into victory. Section 3 from west, 4, delay 15, avoid wake chop, left bias confirmed. The sea, polished and merciless, offered back only reflection and run-in paths. Inside Yamato, the human scale reasserted itself. A sailor taped a photograph back to a bulkhead that no longer stayed vertical. A medic tore his last bandage in half and made 2 honest lies out of 1 truth. A signalman, his lamp smashed, began to use flags out of habit and hope in a world where neither mattered. A turret captain counted helmets instead of men because the helmets stayed. An electrician found a fuse that still felt warm and felt, against his will, a flicker of gratitude toward an object. Reports reached the bridge with fewer hedges. List increasing. Starboard pumps failing. Forward magazines secure, aft uncertain. Steering answering with delay. Ito's replies remained spare. Acknowledgments, course orders, the kind of permission a commander owes to men who already know what they must do. The pagoda mast, so proud in blueprints, began to feel like a ladder to nothing. Yet the guns kept speaking, slower, angrier, dignified despite futility. They threw half-ton arguments into a sky that refused debate and into a horizon that yielded only spray. Somewhere in the swarm above, a pilot who had never seen a battleship before this morning began to understand scale not as size but as stubbornness. He rolled in again, sight picture steady, and felt the world narrow to airspeed and angle and the brief, violent honesty of release. He did his small, precise work, as did the sailor below who tightened one last shore and the chaplain who whispered one last sentence. Wars end in arithmetic, but they pass through hands. There is always a moment, so late it hides inside denial, when a ship the size of a city becomes a thing the sea can throw. The final pattern arrived with indifferent order. Torpedoes found the softened flank low and forward. Shock punched through decks and frames. Flooded volumes nudged the angle into inevitability. Counterflood could not catch it. The bow dug, the stern rose, the horizon slanted into a fact no order could revise. Men ran uphill toward level that no longer existed. Air trapped in compartments sought any throat to escape. Steam hissed like snakes. Cables snapped with whips' tempers. The ship groaned, an animal remembering quarries and furnaces and promises, then rolled past argument. Capsizing is choreography and catastrophe at once. Guns tore from trunnions, boats broke loose and scythed, ladders became blades. Some leaped because the body insists on the chance of water over the certainty of steel. Others rode their posts to the angle's end, hands on tasks they had been married to for years. On the bridge, Ito's silence weighed more than any shout. He made the choice captains make when the deck will not bear their weight much longer. Around him, the windows became floors, then ceilings, then sky. A signalman tried to send one last lamp message and found only sun in his face. Underwater, compartments inhaled ocean. Powder magazines met fate and answered with a detonation no ear owns, white, then red, then absence. The hull split an idea into pieces. A flower of light lifted itself miles into air, a witness nobody needed and everybody saw. Shock rolled across pilots' canopies. Aviators flinched, then watched in professional sorrow as metal turned into weather. Oil sheets flashed and spread. Fragments rained. The sea accepted everything because that is what seas do. Silence afterward is never silent. It holds whistles, shouts, coughing, the frantic arithmetic of counting heads that cannot be found. Rafts bloomed, hands reached, some were taken. Others slid under and did not return. The Americans circled warily, respectful in distance, careful of submarines, careful of survivors who might be enemies this minute and only men the next. On carrier radios a sentence formed, concise, unlyrical, heavy with consequence. Primary target sunk. Far away, rooms applauded or simply exhaled. Nearer, the air smelled of fuel, salt, and endings. The ocean wrote a brief obituary in oil and foam and began, as oceans do, to forget. Impact ripples outward in rings you can see, and rings you can only count years later. Okinawa's sky, briefly less crowded, filled again by afternoon. The factories that might have craved Yamato's steel had already fallen silent. The men who built her had learned to sleep without roofs. The nation she symbolized was starving on islands of loyalty surrounded by seas of defeat. Yet even symbols die loudly. News bulletins framed the sortie as sacrifice. Enemy briefings filed it under expended threat downstream in history. Arguments still stand helmet to helmet over whether courage without utility is nobility or waste. The sea refuses to arbitrate. It always has work to do. For the Americans, the lesson arrived pre-labeled. Air controls sea when doctrine admits it and even when it does not. For the Japanese sailors who watched their world roll past 90 degrees, the lesson wore human faces. Friends lost, rituals finished, an empire's stubborn grammar spoken in a voice gone hoarse. Survivors floated amid oil and ash and remembered small things with savage clarity. The taste of rice the night before, the squeak of chalk on a bulkhead, the way a boatswain's pipe starts slightly sharp when the lips are cold. Rescue came awkwardly, sporadically, and sometimes not at all. Barnes and historians would later tally tonnage, sorties, hit probabilities, footage. They would measure triumph in angles and sinkings. Yet in quiet rooms another arithmetic kept its own books, the weight of letters that never reached mothers, the heaviness of medals pinned over absences, the way officers carry decisions into sleep and wake with them still marching. Yamato's death did not end surface warfare or the longing men have for ships that answer to hands. It did help close a century-long argument about battleships and airplanes, with a verdict too loud to ignore and too costly to cheer. In museums, children stare up at models and see heroism carved in plastic. Curators write plaques that do their best to say everything in 2 paragraphs and fail honestly. Veterans, on any side, stand a little apart and keep their own counsel. Memory edits. Myth accretes. The line between reverence and romance blurs. It is tempting to say the sea keeps secrets. It does not. It keeps time. If you listen long enough, you can hear the cadence. Engines into wind, orders into headsets, torpedoes into water, steel into silence, and men, always men, into the long echo where names try to live. Years crept forward and made distance that did not heal so much as instruct. The dams and mills rebuilt, the islands learned new alphabets of law. The airfields that launched hunters turned into runways for passengers who measure danger in turbulence and schedules. Somewhere in a city, a photograph of Yamato gathers dust in a frame, its caption fiercely brief. Somewhere on a shelf, a sailor's letter remains sealed, the crease permanent, the ink untested by tears. History does not move on, it moves through, carrying weight that changes shape but not mass. Barnacled fragments of the great ship sleep beneath lanes where freighters pass with indifferent grace. Fish claim compartments. Currents write their own logbooks across armor once worshipped as proof against everything but time. In lecture halls, cadets parse Tengo as an exam in doctrine. Fuel, air cover, intent, drawing lines that feel clean on whiteboards and blur in spray. In quiet houses, descendants wonder what courage is for if not to be spent, and whether spending it wisely always means spending it visibly. The question is old and urgent. When a blade cannot change the battle, does the hand still owe it a swing? Our story returns to the decks before dawn, to boots on ladders and letters in pockets, to a chaplain rehearsing sentences, to a vice admiral reading angles from instinct. It returns to pilots breathing through checklists, to ordnancemen checking pins with blackened thumbs, to a mechanic tapping a cowling like a charm. It returns because the meaning lives there, incompetence offered to an impossible task, in duty saluted even as arithmetic frowns, in the brief intersection where men, machines, weather, and will draw a shape and call it fate. You and I inherit not verdicts, but responsibilities. To remember without ornament, to admire without lying, to grieve without pretending grief is wisdom. When we say Yamato, we should hear engines turning water into rumor, hear radios trading syllables, hear the quiet after a blast when choices die and kindness begins. We should picture a wake written across gray sea and erased by the same hand that wrote it. The ocean keeps time, the names we speak keep meaning. Operation Tengo was not a riddle the war asked us to solve. It was a mirror the war held up to us, asking what we think strength is and what price we are still willing to pay to be right about it.